And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hello, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. Thanks for joining for our marine section. Starting off today, we want to take a look at some of the iceberg activity up in the Arctic Ocean. Now, back in 2020, there was a partial collapse of the Milne ice shelf, and that ice has been moving down into our areas since then. We're now starting to track that. The National Weather Service's Alaska Sea Ice Program has been putting that on the ice maps now. You can see this blue line here is indicating how far south that we know that those icebergs can get. You can see the black arrows here indicate the Beaufort gyre that is helping to bring down that ice and then move it back up into the Arctic after coming nearest to the northern coasts of Alaska. Notice that the blue line hugs just to the north from much of the Arctic coast, but it does make it into land areas there just east of Utqiagvik and then through an area just to the north of Wainwright. So be mindful any activities out in those waters that there is the potential to see some scattered icebergs, again from that Milne partial collapse of the ice shelf. Taking a look at the rest of the sea ice edge, we do still have some ice up along the Arctic coast right now, but of note, we are starting to see some ice out north of the Bering Strait, and we could see some of that move even closer to Kivalina over the next couple days due to some more scattered wind directions. But as we get into Friday and we start to see the winds become more northerly, we do expect ice up farther to the north and down in the southern portions of the Chukchi Sea to move farther to the south. Quick recap for Thursday as we move into our marine forecast. Again, calmer winds up in the areas by the Bering Strait, which is one of the reasons why we could see some of that ice move farther to the east. And then we have westerly winds through much of the Bering Sea as we have a low moving through the area, which is also bringing a lot of the precipitation to the mainland portion of the state. And then some stronger winds as we get a little bit closer towards the Aleutian Islands. Ridging out over the Gulf waters is going to keep some lighter winds through much of the area, but we will see some rain coming in from a low out by Kodiak Island, pushing rain into south central and eventually out farther to the east. As we move into Friday, that low is going to move out into the northern portion of the Gulf, bringing widespread rain to areas of the Gulf as well as the North Gulf Coast and Panhandle. As we look out over the Arctic coastline, we will see some of those tighter isobars indicating stronger winds again out of that northerly direction, which is going to start to push some of that ice farther to the south. And then some lighter winds in the southeastern Bering, but we could see some stronger winds coming into the Aleutian Islands with the low moving in closer towards the western Aleutians. So taking a look now at the marine forecast, starting off in the inside waters for southeast Alaska, pretty light around 10 knots there, becoming southerly as we get farther to the north and picking up to 15 knots as we get up by Lynn Canal. Westerly winds expected out over the eastern portions of the Gulf, 10 to 15 knots. So move into Thursday, pretty light over the Gulf waters, mostly around 10, picking up though as we get closer towards Yakutat area. Easterly winds 25 knots to the west of Yakutat. In the inside waters, primarily a southerly wind direction, around 10 knots, picking up by Lynn Canal up to 15. For Thursday for south central Alaska, weaker winds out through much of the Gulf waters, slight southerly component, only around 10 knots. By the Barren Islands, however, a little bit stronger there. Small craft winds at 25 knots out of a southeasterly direction, and then southerly winds in the Cook Inlet area, 20 knots in southern locations, dropping down to 15 as we get farther to the north. Then on Friday, winds picking up in the Cook Inlet area up to 25 knots out of a primarily southerly direction. Barren Island's going to see a change in direction out of a westerly direction, now 15 to 20 knots there. And southeast winds for the northern portions of the Gulf, getting up to as high as 25 knots in the far northern locations, and in Prince William Sound, easterly winds at 20 knots expected. For Thursday for the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, around Kodiak Island, southwesterly winds 15 to 20 knots expected. And then for the Alaska Peninsula, primarily southwest around 15 knots. For Friday, starting to weaken by the Alaska Peninsula area, but picking up as we get closer towards Kodiak Island, all the way up to 20 to 25 knots out of a west to southwest direction. For the Aleutian Islands on Thursday, for the central and eastern Aleutian Islands, southwest winds 15 knots, some areas getting as high as 20 knots. Weaker winds and out of an easterly direction for the western Aleutian Islands, 10 to 15 knots expected there. As we move into Friday, still primarily an easterly direction out by the western Aleutians, around 20 knots is expected. Light winds by the eastern Aleutian Islands, 10 knots there, and then southeast winds for the central Aleutians, 15 to 20 knots. Along the west coast of the state, going to kind of hug the coastline. Southeast winds south of Nunavut Island becoming southwest winds to the north, getting up to as high as 15 knots in the Norton Sound area, but only around 10 knots south of Nunavut Island. Variable winds 10 knots by St. Matthew Island, and then by the Pribilof, southwest winds 20 knots expected. On Friday, becoming southwesterly out over the Bering Sea, 15 knots there, and then westerly winds all along the southwest coastline, around 15 knots is expected. Along the west coast of the state, pretty light winds, variable wind directions, 5 to 10 knots expected, and then still pretty variable up along the Arctic coastline, around 10 knots. As we get into Friday, going to be much more consistent with a north to northeast wind, 15 to 25 knots along the Arctic coast, getting up to as high as 30 knots by Cape Lisburne, and then being a little bit more erratic as we get down closer towards the Bering Strait area, out of a southerly direction, around 15 knots there. With Alaska weather, I'm David Kramer. Thanks for watching.